elementary penguin singing Hare Krishna. Man, you should have seen him kicking Edgar Allan Poe. That's a line. Well, if you're a Beatles fan, you know where that's from. I Am the Walrus. One of John Lennon's great songs. I think it's one of the coolest songs ever recorded. It's not what I wanted to talk about. I actually wanted to read a little bit from a book that I published in 2016, maybe 2017. Actually, it was probably 2017. It's called Who Am I? Yoga, Psychedelics, and the Quest for Enlightenment is the name of the book. It's all about yoga, the question of yoga and psychedelics. I don't really want to go into that much at this moment. What I want to go into is the Beatles and what happened with George and John in terms of their spiritual life, because they were the most spiritual of the Beatles in terms of they were really seeking something. I'm sure that Ringo and Paul were on some level too, but John and George were it seemed to be more looking for something. And I think they both found something, right? They both found what they were looking for. And this is what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to read a little part of this book. I did a whole chapter on rock music and psychedelics and yoga. And I think there's what to be said about that subject, all those subjects together. For example, just as another example, Carlos Santana. So he, first he didn't take any drugs, and then he started taking drugs, right? And then he started to follow this guru named Sri Chinmoy. This is in the early 70s. John McLaughlin did as well. And Santana and McLaughlin actually did a really cool album together called Love, Devotion, Surrender. And, you could write a whole book about the subject of yoga, rock music, drugs, the 60s, the 70s. What I really want to talk about, I'm going to read a little bit from this chapter. And I've also been doing my own translation of the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm about to publish it. And I've been talking a little bit on this channel about Srila Prabhupada and the Hare Krishna movement. And you'll see why this is important. The Hare Krishna movement got started in New York City in 66. Srila Prabhupada came from India. He basically didn't have any money, and he started this worldwide movement. It's incredible, actually, that this huge movement started from this old guy who had almost no money, and this whole huge movement started. That's one of the biggest religious movements in the world to this day. Nothing's going to change my world. The Beatles, the Maharishi, and the Hare Krishnas. That's the name of this section. John Lennon on the Dick Cavett show said, if people take any notice of what we say we've been through the drug scene, man, and there's nothing like being straight. And that was September 24th, 1971. This is after the Beatles broke up. A Hare Krishna sign in the 60s said, stay high all the time, chant Hare Krishna. That was the message to the flower children. You don't need to take drugs. You can just chant and you'll get high. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Do it enough times and you won't need drugs ever again. So this is what I wrote. It is well known that the Beatles were heavily influenced by both Hindu spirituality and psychedelics. John Lennon was turned on, quote unquote, turned on by Timothy Leary's work, and by his own account, he took LSD over 1,000 times in just a few years. Lennon said he often read Timothy Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience, while high on LSD, and he even composed a song based on it, the highly psychedelic Tomorrow Never Knows, which is on Revolver, the Beatles album Revolver. Even the comparatively pure Paul McCartney went through an acid phase, telling Life magazine that LSD, quote, opened my eyes and made me a better, more honest, and more tolerant member of society. From an artistic standpoint, it's clear that regardless of what the Beatles later claimed, if it weren't for LSD, works of genius like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper would never have come into existence. And the same can probably be said for much of the quote, classic rock music of that era. So the Beatles later kind of forswore psychedelics. They played it down a lot, and they said, no, we took a lot of drugs, but that didn't influence our music. But that's not true. Come on. Yet despite LSD's transformative highs, it wasn't long before the Beatles felt they had passed, quote, the acid test with flying double rainbow kaleidoscopic colors, and were now prepared to graduate onto other, possibly more natural means of personal and societal transformation. As George Harrison declared at the time, acid is not the answer. It's enabled people to see a bit more, but when you really get hip, you don't need it. Harrison's thoughts reflect the general sentiment of the Beatles and many of the youth of that era. It was becoming clear for a number of young seekers that psychedelics alone simply could not produce lasting changes in consciousness. There was a growing sense that a psychedelic revolution was not going to be the harbinger of world peace, nor a golden age of enlightenment. Yet there was still ambivalence about revolution, any revolution, whether it was radically changing the world or changing one's consciousness about the world. This ambivalence was reflected in the lyrics of John Lennon's initial version of the song Revolution, which was released in 1968. But when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out? And then he also said in, right? Lennon was clearly not ready to put himself completely in the yogi and peacemaker camp just yet. The Beatles first met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in August of 1967. By the way, just because you're a yogi doesn't mean that you are completely nonviolent, although nonviolence is definitely a very important principle in yoga. It's right there in the Yoga Sutras. But that's a whole nother question. The Beatles first met Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in August of 1967. They were so impressed with the transcendental meditation guru that the following year they went to a TM teacher training retreat at the Maharishi's ashram in Rishikesh. The band was beginning to see the possibility that meditation might be a more useful tool for lasting evolutionary change than psychedelics. And most admirably, they were open to putting that pregnant possibility to the test. What happened next is particularly of note for us. Not long into the retreat, word got around that the Maharishi made sexual advances toward Mia Farrow, or one of the group. It wasn't clear who it was, but Mia Farrow was named, and she later became a famous actress in like Woody Allen movies. And she was Lennon's girlfriend at the time. Lennon promptly denounced the guru, putting an abrupt end to the Beatles' yoga and meditation idol in India. John was kind of like the ringleader in that. He went to the Maharishi. He said, "We think that you've been sleeping with one of our women." And he said, actually, when they first came to see him, he was like, "Why are you coming to see me?" And John was like, "Well, if you're omniscient, then you should know. If you're so omniscient, then you should know why we're coming to see you." John recounted the story to Jan Wenner in their famous 1970 Rolling Stone interview. This is what John said. Actually, I don't know if I'm going to read this whole thing. You can buy my book. Buy my book and read that whole story about what happened there. But the upshot of it was that the Beatles left. They didn't continue with Maharishi. and then Ono said to John, after John told this whole story about leaving Maharishi, Yoko Ono said, "You expected too much from him." Yoko Ono is probably correct. We have perhaps had unreasonable expectation of gurus, and yet when they or their followers declare themselves to be chaste and all-knowing, is it unreasonable to hold them to that? All right. So, quote from George Harrison: "All you need is love," and then he has in parentheses Krishna. "All you need is love, Krishna." And then John Lennon's quote from 1970: "If there is a God, we're all it." I think that's one of the great quotes of all time about God. If there is a God, we're all it. These issues were to be revived again the next fall when the Beatles met the man who started the Hare Krishna movement in the West, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. He was also known as Swami Bhaktivedanta and later Srila Prabhupada. In September of 1969, John Lennon and George Harrison, plus John's new paramour, Yoko Ono, met with Srila Prabhupada, who was then called Swami Bhaktivedanta. The Swami was the founder of the fledgling but rapidly expanding Krishna consciousness movement. In just a few years in America, Bhaktivedanta had already inspired a large following among the hippie communities in New York and the Bay Area. 2 years earlier, in January 1967, the biggest bands on the San Francisco scene, including The Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver, and Moby Grape, played a concert to benefit the local Hare Krishna temple. Timothy Leary and the Acid Chemist, Owsley Stanley too, were in attendance, as was beat poet Allen Ginsberg, who introduced the Hare Krishna Swami to the throng of thousands of hippies. In his address to the crowd, Ginsberg, and a quote, experienced veteran of psychedelics, recommended that those coming down from LSD stop by the Krishna temple in order to help, quote, stabilize their consciousness on re-entry, unquote. By stating this, was Ginsberg subtly trying to rein in the wilder equestrian aspects of the psychedelic movement into a more, quote, stable channel of spiritual discipline? I ask because around that time, Prabhupada had told Ginsberg that LSD was not necessary for the devotee of Krishna. The Swami's words to Ginsberg were, Krishna consciousness resolves everything, nothing else is needed. Not that Ginsberg didn't know this or hadn't heard it before. His own early psychedelic experiences had been fraught with paradox and ambivalence. He had never really gotten back to the purity of his original cosmic revelation as he read Blake's Sunflower way back in 1948. For years, he sought to recapture this experience, as many spiritual seekers do, myself included, but to no avail. Finally, in 1960, on a pilgrimage to India, he met with Swami Shivananda, who counseled him, your own heart is your guru. Anyway, I'm not going to go into this whole thing about Ginsberg. I'm going to skip that. So, turning again now to the historic meeting between Prabhupada and George Harrison, John Lennon, and Yoko Ono in 1969, we find the same tension. The difficulty here, however, was less about LSD, which is already on its way out of fashion, and more in reference to important questions of authority, power, and lineage. Without going into too much detail, during the course of Srila Prabhupada's opening discourse to the two Beatles and Yoko, he urges the assembled trio to, quote, try to understand this Krishna consciousness, which he notes is not a sectarian or religious movement. Some people say it is, right? Some people say that definitely it is. But he was pretty adamant that this is not a sectarian or religious movement. And he said, judge with your intellect, the Swami suggests in his British accent at one point, and you will find it sublime. After his discourse, John and Yoko press him with questions and concerns, many of which are still relevant to this discussion, meaning the discussion of the book that I'm writing. One critical issue that John and Yoko bring up is the question of authority. Yoko says, what is your answer to this question of authority? What is authority and who has the authority? John says, yes, we should go to a true master, you say, but how are we to tell one from the other? That's what we're doing. We're going around. Actually, Yoko never met the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, so we're asking for advice about how to know what's real. So who's the real guru? Who's the real deal? Prabhupada's answer to them is sampradaya, meaning lineage. You have to have a teacher who is of a true lineage. And if you look at Prabhupada's translation of the Bhagavad Gita, he lists his whole lineage from the very beginning until him. Like 32, there's 32 gurus in this succession of teachers. One receiving it from the other, all the way down to Prabhupada. Of course, to John and Yoko, that just begged the question of how one can tell one lineage from another and which one to follow, right? How do you know that the lineage, okay, you say that's your lineage, but how do I know that's true, right? I can question that. Everything can be questioned. John says Maharishi said he's doing the same thing. His mantra is coming from the Vedic tradition, seemingly with as much mythology as you, and he was probably right. So it's like having so many fruits. So he's saying, well, you have a lineage, Maharishi has a lineage, that guru has a lineage. Which lineage do you follow? How do you know what the right one is? If there is one right one, or maybe they're all right. Prabhupada replies that the Hare Krishna mantra is the best mantra for this age, naming the Kali Yuga, the dark age of materialism. Yoko, if it's the best one, why should we bother with anything else? If the Hare Krishna mantra is such a powerful mantra, is there any reason to chant any other songs or mantras? John says, isn't it a matter to the devotee? Isn't it just like a matter of taste? It's all the name of God, so it doesn't really make much difference, does it, which mantra you do? And I wrote, these are good questions. They didn't call Lennon the intellectual Beatle for nothing. Clearly, Yoko is also asking questions too. Meanwhile, George is characteristically quiet. George is not saying anything. What is he thinking? Is he silently fuming at John and Yoko for their intellectual mind games? Can't they see that this man, Prabhupada, is a true master and divine messenger? And just what are John and Yoko thinking? Are they thinking that Srila Prabhupada has not given any satisfying answers to their most important questions? Perhaps the answer can be found in George and John's subsequent song lyrics. In December of that year, George penned My Sweet Lord. In the style of a Bhakti Yoga belting out a bhajan, Harrison expresses his intense desire to see and know and be with Krishna. And the words of that song are, my sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, I really want to see you, I really want to be with you, I really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord. That was George's song, My Sweet Lord. In December of the following year, 1970, John writes the song God, in which he expresses, among other things, I don't believe in mantra, I don't believe in Gita, I don't believe in yoga, I just believe in me. Yoga and me, and that's reality. The dream is over. What can I say? The dream is over yesterday. I was the dream weaver, but now I'm reborn. I was the walrus, but now I'm John. And so, dear friends, you just have to carry on. The dream is over. In other words, John Lennon and the Beatles may have been, quote, bigger than Jesus, as Lennon famously told a reporter, but John never claimed to be Jesus or God. He was a simple human being like the rest of us who had to carry on and, quote, carry that weight a long time. That's a reference to one of the Beatles songs on Abbey Road. He seemed to finally understand that no matter how long and winding a spiritual seeker's road may be, we all have to go through whatever we need to learn in order to find and live our own truth. Here is Rolling Stone editor Jan Wenner asking Lennon directly about he and Harrison's seemingly divergent paths in the now famous January 1971 magazine interview. And Wenner said to Lennon, it's strange that George comes out with his Hare Krishna and you come out with the opposite, especially after that. So he's pointing to the fact, what I just pointed to, which is they came out with two very different songs. Lennon, I can't imagine what George thinks. Well, I suppose he thinks I've lost the way or something like that, but to me, I'm like home. I'll never change much from this. Let's see how much more we have to go here. Yeah. We'll just read through the rest of this. Note how Lennon's reply echoes the famous line from the Beatles song Across the Universe, a line, of course, which can be read any number of ways. Nothing's going to change my world. He seemed to be saying the same thing there. You know, like I'm not going to change from what I've come to right now. My world is not going to change very much. Earlier that year, George had written the foreword to Prabhupada's book, Krishna, the Supreme Personality of the Godhead. So George Harrison actually wrote the foreword to this book by Prabhupada, in which he proposes something that on the surface appears radically different from John's new direction. This is what George wrote in his foreword. Yoga, a scientific method for God, self-realization, is the process by which we purify our consciousness, stop further pollution, and arrive at the state of perfection, full knowledge, full bliss. If there's a God, I want to see him. It's pointless to believe in something without proof, and Krishna consciousness and meditation are methods where you can actually obtain God perception. You can actually see God and hear him, play with him. It might sound crazy, but he is actually there, actually with you. Now, did George really experience this himself? I question that, right? I would question that. Unless he was high on something too, I don't know. But although, you know, I'm sure Hare Krishna devotees have experienced that. I just don't know if George did, but all right. Swami Bhakti Vedanta is, as his title says, a bhakti yogi following the path of devotion. This is George. By serving God through each thought, word, and deed, and by chanting his holy names, the devotee quickly develops God consciousness. By chanting Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama. I request that you take advantage of this book, Krishna, and enter into its understanding. I also request that you make an appointment to meet your God now through the self-liberating process of yoga, union, and give peace a chance. All you need is love, in parentheses, Krishna, Haribol. George Harrison. Anyway. All right, signed George Harrison. You'll note here that George has put his own spin on two of John's songs, All You Need Is Love and Give Peace a Chance. He's quoting John at the end of his thing. Right? This is very telling. Although their approaches are quite different, the end goals of these two ex-Beatles, love and peace, are the same. Right? George is quoting John. He's quoting two of John's songs in what he's writing. John and George were both looking for that same thing, and I think they were sincere in that. We might say that George is more of a bhakta, a person who seeks God through love and devotion, and that John is a jnani, or a person who seeks God through discriminating intellect. Neti, not this, not that. Or we could say that George is more Vishnu, the preserver, incarnating as Krishna to be the upholder of cosmic order, whereas John is Shiva, the destroyer and jester of Soma, clearing the way to 1,000 ego deaths. That said, it is best not to perceive this as a black and white either-or issue. Both Beatles were complex individuals who embodied both bhakta and jnani streams in their lives and work. In any case, bhakti and jnana yogas are but two divergent rivers leading to the same ocean of love. So I was trying to paint George as more of a bhakta and John more as a jnani, although you can't really do that. I think they were both. And George also took a lot of LSD, apparently. Not just John. John took a lot of LSD, but so did George. And George talked on Dick Cavett about smoking pot too. And, George Harrison remained aligned with Krishna consciousness for the rest of his life. Like Gandhi, who uttered the name of Ram as he was shot by Nathuram Godse, so too did George utter Hare Krishna as he was being attacked by Michael Abram in his home only 2 years prior to his passing. So as George was being shot, or as he was being attacked, he started chanting Hare Krishna. Interestingly, the other Beatles, including John Lennon, remained more or less in the Maharishi camp. Right, so the other Beatles didn't go for the Hare Krishna thing. Only George did. Most particularly, Paul McCartney, who in recent years staged a concert in New York City to benefit the Transcendental Meditation movement and honor the late guru of the Beatles. I personally find this all fascinating because I've experienced both sides of the equation. I've walked in George's shoes to some extent. I've also more recently begun to see things more from the perspective of John and Yoko. Then I talk about myself. I'm not going to read this whole part, but I think the main thing I wanted to get across here is that both John and George talked to the same guy, right? They both talked to Srila Prabhupada in person. They got it from his mouth, right? John didn't go for it, right? He was like, no. Yoko didn't go for it. George did. George saw something there that John and Yoko did not. Now, some people say that George was really the most profound one. George was the best songwriter. George was this. George was that. Could be, who knows? I personally think that John was a very profound individual. He is also the one that gets crapped on the most. I know people that hate John Lennon. There was a book that came out about him that was not favorable to him at all. I think it was called The Lives of John Lennon by Albert Goldstein, I believe was his name. You can look it up on Amazon, but it was not very favorable to John Lennon, but it came out that it was really full of rumors and gossip and it wasn't wasn't a good book. Probably not very accurate. All you got to do is listen to John's music, listen to the Beatles, listen to John's words. You know that he was a deep soul. He was a deep thinker. He had his issues, as we all do, but he was on the path, right? He was a yogi. He wouldn't have called himself a yogi, but he was he was a seeker. All right, so my point here is I think this whole Hare Krishna thing is very interesting, and it obviously it was a movement that took off like like a rocket, like mid 60s. By 1969 it was already becoming a very big thing, right? To this day, let's do just a quick search where how many Hare Krishnas, how many Hare Krishnas are there? Just doing a quick Google search. 1 million. It's not a lot. $1 million is not a lot, but it's had a very big impact. And Prabhupada's translation of the Bhagavad Gita is the most read. It's millions of copies of that are out there. So even though there might be like 1 million followers that call themselves Hare Krishnas, it's had a very big impact beyond that, right? It's kind of like, like 1 million people live there, but how many people visit? So how many people actually visit and do like tours of, right? Probably more like 10 to 20 to 30 million. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope this was a little bit interesting. This audio of their meeting with Prabhupada can be found online. I'll see if I can find it, and I'll put it in the description of this video so you can listen to it yourself. It's a very interesting interview between Prabhupada, Yoko, John, and George. Anyway, and my book Who Am I is out on Amazon. I'll put a link to that as well if you wanna take a look. Thanks for listening. All you need is love. Give peace a chance, and my sweet Lord.